Last week, in the first half of Viewpoints, we touched on the current student loan crisis. More than 43 million Americans have this type of debt, and that number is only growing. Recent headlines have brought some relief as the Biden administration announced it's canceling $10,000 or, for lower-income borrowers, up to $20,000 in student loans. But while this is a step in the right direction, it does little to solve the real long-term problem. That is, the lack of affordability for current and future students pursuing higher education. In recent decades, tuition costs have skyrocketed, leaving no choice for many people but to go into debt if they want a degree. The College Board, a higher education nonprofit, just published its latest numbers on the average cost per year for an in-state student attending a four-year public university.
The average tuition and fees are $12,310, but if you add room and board to that, you get to $23,250. So in other words, you got to add about $11,000, and that's just for room and board. That doesn't include transportation, books and supplies, etc. And so the total budget on average for a public four-year in-state student is now $27,940.
That's Sandy Baum, a higher education expert and a non-resident senior fellow at the Center on Education Data and Policy at the Urban Institute. Baum says that even if you round down to $27,000 per year, multiply that by 4 years, and the total cost of an undergraduate comes to about $108,000. Currently, 70% of students earning bachelor's degrees leave with debt by the time they graduate. Mark Tentroits, a financial aid expert, believes that the government needs to better support students by offering more grants in place of loans. This form of financial aid is better than borrowing for those who can qualify because it typically doesn't need to be paid back. But some might be wondering, why should the government spend even more? Tentroits argues that this long-term investment on students yields a net positive for the budget.
A bachelor degree recipient pays more than twice the federal income tax of a high school graduate. That increased federal income tax revenue covers the cost of the financial aid that enabled the student to get that degree in about 10 years. Most people work for 40 years. So there's 30 years of pure profit to the federal government. It's not just a good investment for the federal government, it's the best possible investment. It's the equivalent of a 14% annualized return on investment. If you came to me and you said, I've got this investment that's going to pay you 14% a year for 40 years, I'd ask you if your name was Bernie Madoff.
Currently, each year, about 30 to 40% of all undergraduate students take out federal student loans. For some low-income students who refuse to go into debt, the alternative is working full-time and trying to make ends meet.
If you're told you're going to have to borrow more for your college education than your parents earn in a year, that'll give you pause. And that stops many low-income students from pursuing a college education because they usually don't have much experience with debt. And if they have experience with debt, it's a negative one. So they fear debt, and that stops them from enrolling. Whereas middle and high-income students may not like debt, but it doesn't stop them from enrolling. And there are some cultural groups, ethnic, racial groups, like, for example, Hispanic students, who would rather work 3 jobs than borrow. And when you work a full-time job, you're half as likely to attain a bachelor's degree within 6 years as compared to someone who works only 12 hours or less a week during the academic term.
Not to mention that part of the college experience is building a network. This requires time. One initiative that would greatly help low-income students is increasing the maximum cap for Pell Grants.
The cost of the program annually is less than $30 billion a year. That's a drop in the bucket when it comes to the federal budget. It's partly political because college graduates tend to be slightly more likely to vote Democrat than Republican. So originally, the Higher Education Act of 1965 was enacted with strong bipartisan support. Since then, however, the political parties have differentiated with regard to their support of a college education, even though both Democrats and Republicans benefit from it.
Tentroits does support the one-time relief plan recently announced by President Biden. However, he agrees that it's merely a Band-Aid that doesn't address the root of the problem.
At current borrowing rates, we'll be back where we were before this forgiveness in just 4 or 5 years. So it's a one-time event. It's not a permanent solution. The things that we need to do in order to solve this is to replace the loans with grants. And if someone demonstrates financial needs, they should not be required to borrow anything. It should entirely be with grants. Now that'll cost an additional $30 to $40 billion a year, but that's affordable for the federal government. I mean, that's a small fraction of the military budget, and I dare say that it has at least as much importance for national security as an additional aircraft carrier.
He notes that there would also need to be limits on these grants, one being that students should be limited to in-state public universities, which would come at a much lower cost to the government.
We should provide enough grants so that they can go to a good quality college, like an in-state public college. They should be guaranteed coverage of the cost of a college, not any college. It'll be like the current treatment of elementary and secondary school, where public K-12 is free or mostly free. If you want to send your child to a private high school, you pay for it. We should adopt a similar model for higher education. I mean, public college should be free textbooks, free tuition, other major expenses should be covered. If you want to send your child to a higher cost private college, well, then you'll have to pay the difference.
This model of paying the difference would also give students more options to seek out programs that would normally be unattainable. At the same time, it ensures that low-income students who don't want to accumulate any debt can get a degree somewhere. The upside is that it allows the country to prevent more debt from piling up while still making an investment in students that over time should be paid back in the form of income tax. To find out more about student loan forgiveness, financial aid resources, and our guests, Sandy Baum and Mark Tentroits, visit viewpointsradio.org. This segment was written and produced by Amira Zaveri. I'm Gary Price. Coming up on Viewpoints.
The half-life of caffeine is about 6 hours. And so that means that if you have a double espresso at 4 p.m., at 10 p.m., you still have a single espresso in your system.
Struggling to sleep? These mistakes could be throwing you off. Then,
it is kind of odd, isn't it, that we are so fascinated by these people that we're never going to meet and that we want to talk about them and know the latest thing about them.
The psychology behind celebrity gossip. I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.